Started, everyone. So welcome to the Sustainability Discussion Series again for everyone who has joined us before, or welcome if this is your first time. Tonight we'll be talking about social sustainability. So my name is Olivia and I'll be your moderator today along with Emily. Before we begin, I want you to know that if you haven't seen it, I put the first question into the group chat at the bottom of the screen so that you can start thinking about it before we begin the conversation. So this discussion series is intended to give the audience a chance to share their ideas on topics revolving around sustainability and discuss the relationship between social, economic, and environmental justice. We want all of you to come away from these with a deeper understanding of not only others' perspectives, but also your own. Just a reminder, this is being recorded and will be available on YouTube after the meeting. It's up to you if you want to share your video, and you can turn that on and off by clicking the camera at the bottom of the screen. You can also mute and unmute yourself by clicking the microphone button, and we just ask that you keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking or getting ready to speak. I will prompt and guide our discussion throughout the evening by posing questions to you. Throughout the discussion, you're welcome to share your thoughts out loud through the group chat or just sit back and listen. So feel free to enter the conversation as you like, and the moderators don't have to call on you. The first time that you talk, we ask that you briefly introduce yourself and what your interest in sustainability is. So like I said, I'm Olivia, and I'm currently a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, where I research how meteorologists communicate. And my interest in sustainability comes from just being really passionate about environmental and social justice. So we're gonna start off the discussion tonight with the question, how would you define social sustainability?
I would say social sustainability is kind of about a society in which all people have access to the opportunities that they need, and that everyone has equal opportunity as well. And I guess just to add on to that, it kind of seems like if social issues are pushed under the rug, it only seems like it's a matter of time before they're brought to the forefront again. And I think we've been seeing that a lot with the social justice movements that are going on. So if you want to have a society where there's never any protests, then if you want to define that as this, socially sustainable, then you have to have justice for everyone who's within that society, and justice that acknowledges people's differences as well.
Okay, and so then going off of that, with Alexandra's comment, we should be striving for a community where people who are benefiting, their benefits aren't harming other people. So when we were planning for this discussion, one of the definitions that we found from Google was that social sustainability is a proactive way of managing and identifying business impacts on employees, workers in the value and supply chain, customers, and local communities. So what are your thoughts on that, and how do you think that kind of applies to the concept of social sustainability? Do you want to expand on that a little bit, Alexandria? What you mean by carrying sway in those areas?
Yeah, sure. I'll speak instead of typing everything. So just to elaborate on that, I think that in the world that we're living in, from the American perspective, there is a lot of news that can break that will influence all workers and people in a community, no matter if it's out in the country or if it's in an urban, suburban area, based off of what politicians do online, what movements have gained followers online, and then the social media kind of has a feedback loop to influence the news. The news influences outrage on social media, and it kind of just cycles. And the sway then connects to who is involved in this discussion and what are they trying to voice.
Okay, so going off of that, how can we maybe think of social media as like a positive force for advocating for social sustainability instead of maybe just a negative one? Because I think right now it can kind of be seen as a negative thing. But is there a way that we can use that positively to like engage in conversation?
I mean, I think social media, even in the past 6 months or so, has given us the ability to kind of look at issues a lot that we wouldn't have had without it.
Yeah, I think, sorry, you can go, Kate.
That's okay, yeah.
Okay, I was just gonna say that like social media, I think especially right now, makes it easier for people to like run campaigns online so they can reach more people that they normally wouldn't. And like Shannon said, you can get information out there easier, you can reach more people, and also because it's on a like social media like format, like you have to put like less information in like a more like a concise way. Like you can't just like link an article because people probably won't read that. It's just like short bullet points about like facts about like social justice issues or like ways that you can change to make your life more sustainable or to make others' lives more sustainable. So I think that that's a positive.
I think something kind of interesting about social media is like, because there's so much information thrown at us, people really latch onto ideas of like sensationalism, and whether that be good or bad. Something that kind of in contrast to that idea, I think with, for example, issues like police brutality, while any one of those stories is definitely like dramatic, and kind of has that sensational edge, because there's been so many along the same narrative, it's almost like they're muted out now. You know, while each story taken individually is something that would catch someone's eye, when taken as a whole and like looked at on that timeline of like this is something that happens, it almost gets rid of the emotional effect for people. And I think social media can try to help elevate that emotion behind it again, but just because it's so common, I think for things that are really common, even social media can't make people latch on as well as maybe they could have before.
Okay, so thinking about how we've been having a lot of conversations, especially in the US recently, about social justice, both on social media and off, in response to like protests going on for racial justice issues specifically. How do you all think America values social justice? Do we value it at all? Do we value it maybe a little bit? And how does like our Constitution and the way that our country was founded maybe impact our perception of social justice?
I think that in this country, we a big part of our culture is individualism, and also a lot of people really like the idea of a meritocracy in this country. So they think that that is true, that they ignore the fact that maybe people don't come from the same amount of privilege or opportunities. and they think that we can, achieve the American dream by raising our social status or our socioeconomic status. That's what I'm trying to say. And what was it? Oh yeah, social justice. I think that prevents Americans from realizing that actually prevents them from achieving social justice. So they say that they value it, but they don't really want to realize what's needed for that.
I think kind of going off of that like social justice, like people only care about social justice when it directly affects them, and like that it, since it affects them, it still is like very selfish in the way that they want like social justice to be brought about.
Yeah, I kind of think about like the black square thing where everyone posted the black square on Instagram, and that was like all they did because it was more of like a trend than actually thinking about how they can incorporate ideas about justice into their life. So yeah, I agree with that, Kate. It's kind of just like for you to make you look good.
I think kind of going back to what we were talking about before and how social media can be used, and also going off of what was just said, people don't act unless it directly impacts them. And I think social media is a way for you to connect with people who come from different backgrounds. And so even if it doesn't impact you in your life personally, if it impacts a close friend or a close associate, you're going to be more likely to try to push for change in that area because you care and you know that person. So I think that's another area that social media can be used to help connect people, to help create a bigger movement around some idea.
Yeah, and I agree with like you're talking about like virtue signaling, Olivia, how like some people only do it because it seems cool. And I've been like thinking a lot about that, and originally I felt weird posting things about like social justice on my personal feed because I was like, am I only doing this because like it looks cool? But I don't think that that has to be a bad thing. Like I think that there can be some positives just because I think it may be changing like the culture of like our generation. So we do like it's considered like normal to like care about these things, to care about other people, where that may not have been like the culture of like the previous generation because it was more like individualist. Um, so I think that because social media is like bringing us all together and making it seem like the expectation is that you care about these things, and so I think that that can be a positive too.
Yeah, I also want to clarify what I meant. I meant like people who just posted the black square and then like didn't do anything about it, didn't reflect on what they like what that means. But yes, I agree with you that social media can like be very, very powerful for like setting the expectation. Also, Shannon, did you want to say something? I think I might have cut you off earlier.
That's okay. I was gonna say, I think social justice means something different to every person. So even if everyone is focused on social justice, since everybody's focused on something different, it seems like nobody else cares because you're only, worried about one thing when someone else is worried about another thing, and it seems like they don't care, but they really care about something else. So I don't know that it's necessarily a lack of caring about social justice so much as cohesion in what that actually means.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And if you like think about the Constitution, I think there's a lot of room for interpretation, and perhaps too much room for interpretation, so that it allows people to be left out.
I was also thinking about the Constitution and like how Americans want to like think that they're perfect and the Constitution is perfect and everything. So they don't want to admit that like there's injustice. So, or especially that they like help keep like unjust systems.
And I kind of think that's ironic because I think when the founding fathers were writing the Constitution, the ability to apply amendments to it was showing that one, what we have right now is not perfect, and two, times are going to change. These rules are going to have to change. So I think if we really wanted to have a mindset of our founding fathers, it's going to be, okay, this is not a stagnant set of rules, that it's going to have to be flexible depending on the circumstances of the day.
So if we get to the point, and hopefully we do get to the point in America where we start thinking about how could we change our policies, our laws, the Constitution even, how would you think about quantifying and what it means to have social sustainability and social justice in a society? Like, how do we know when enough is enough? Or is there ever enough?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You can go.
You can go, Shannon. I've already interrupted somebody this meeting.
Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there.
I was just gonna say that I think a sign. I don't know if there's ever gonna I don't think there's gonna be a point where we don't have to change anymore. I think a good sign is that we're listening to like what people are saying and what they want. So like I don't know if anybody saw this, but I read an article this morning that said Trump wants to enforce a more like pro-America agenda in like schools because he thinks that children are growing up to hate America. So instead of actually addressing why people are upset, he's just going to try and ignore that and make people think that it's not happening, which is not sustainable because people are still going to be mad about that. So that's really frustrating.
Yeah, I think I was going to say sort of a similar thing where like there's obviously always going to be a problem to overcome. But I think when you've reached a state of like social sustainability, it's when those negatives that happen can be dealt with without sacrificing freedom or justice for an individual or for a group of people.
I don't think that there is like an end goal of social sustainability. There's definitely a direction of improvement, but I think as times change, there's going to be new social ills that are going to have to be dealt with, especially with the changing climate. Right now, on the forefront, as it should be, are racial justice movements. But down the road, there's going to be a lot of social inequality based on where people live. I mean, even just looking at the forest fires out west, the discrepancy between the wealthy and people who don't have as much is going to be made more apparent by who's able to rebuild, who has insurance that's, giving them what they need. So I think the road towards social sustainability is going to be like a big, tangle of different directions that we're going to have to go.
I think if the government is listening to or people in leadership positions are listening to what people are saying and minorities and about justice, that it's a good place to start. And also if people in a community are in leadership positions that represent the community, that's good. That's one thing.
I agree. I think that's the biggest thing, making sure everyone actually has their voices heard. You don't want someone telling a different community what they should do to make things better. It's it should be those who are going to live with whatever the consequences of that decision who should be making that decision, because they know what they need, they know what their families and their neighbors need. So I think really listening to people and trying to develop a plan with those who the plan is for.
That's like Alexandria just brought up in the chat, people who are imprisoned in California. And that's a really good point that she brings up, but also it makes me think of how they just passed a law in California where, like, if you're in prison, and they've been using like inmate firefighters to fight the wildfires, which is like its own problem. But then those people, when they would like get out of prison, they couldn't get jobs as firefighters, even though they had been trained. So they did just change that. But even I think like starting to recognize things like that we do that are really problematic, and like a lot of people have already said, like just listening to the people who we're kind of like forcing decisions on, and making sure that they actually get a voice in the conversation too is important. Okay, so we'll kind of like change gears a little bit since this got brought up with Trump and the education and thinking that education is like making people hate America. I guess to start, thinking in your own life, have you, sorry, somebody just texted me. In your own life, what was your experience in school with learning about people who are different than you, if that makes sense? Like, for example, I never learned about like Black people or Native Americans outside of like what they did for white people. So is that also like similar to your experiences? And maybe why do we think that is, and how could we change that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that my education was very whitewashed. I think that could be a term used to describe it. And like everyone in my class was white because I grew up like a small like white community. So nobody like, I mean, especially because we were kids, like nobody seemed to have a problem with it. Nobody was like, I don't feel like anybody felt like they weren't being represented because that was like all the representation that we had. There wasn't anybody else, except for like maybe if we learned about like Native Americans, it was kind of like in a, I don't, like, it wasn't really with respect, I guess. Like, it wasn't a respectful way. It's kind of like, ooh, like, look at them. They're, like, different and, like, not, like, at our level kind of thing. So I think that, like, kind of had an impact on, like, how I looked at people when I grew up. But I kind of, like, have to work through that now because that's, like, how I was taught to look at them.
I think the only time I ever learned about diversity was really during like MLK Day. Like around that time we would learn about diversity, but other than that, not really.
Yeah, I had similar experiences, and I think as far as the why, I think a question to ask would be who wrote the books, who edited the books, and who published the books.
Hi everyone. Sorry to join a bit late. Yes, where are we at in terms of the discussion overall?
Right now, we're talking about the role that education plays in issues of social injustice. So how can education help decrease social injustice, or how does it kind of perpetuate cycles of injustice is where we're at right now.
Interesting. Okay.
I like your point, Alexandria, about how like Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month, like it's only a month. When those, like when people in those, like, what am I trying to say? They only get a month, but like America wouldn't be America if we hadn't like relied on people that we stole from Africa to like help our economy function, but then we only give them like a month of our time in school. So I agree. It's pretty problematic. Kind of going off that, how do you think that education could play a role in making steps towards social or racial or any other kind of justice that we're working towards?
One thing that I was thinking about, so obviously history and how you tell that's extremely important, but in other subjects too, showing representation within successful people within that field. So in English, reading books from people with different backgrounds. In science, talking about scientists who, you know, match different demographics, so that way people can see themselves in any sort of field and they can know that it is a possibility for them, no matter what they look like, what gender they are, where they come from. I think being able to see representation in all of the possible directions you could go with your life is really important, because I think it can have long-term ramifications on who's included in different fields.
Speaking as an educator myself, I am a high school teacher in Southern Illinois. Our school has been very responsive this whole summer, ever since spring break with the pandemic, because during the pandemic is when a lot of these, excuse me, protests after George Floyd was murdered, and of course the many other lives that were lost this summer because of police brutality. But my school has been very inclusive. We have a very diverse population here in Southern Illinois. There's a good portion who is white, a good portion who is Black, a good portion who is Hispanic, and then, you know, we have mixtures of pockets of East Asians, and we don't really have too much Native American, but we have all kinds of people from all walks of life down here, and our school has put out very inclusive and encouraging statements. My school has made an argument to support Black Lives Matter, which is more than some of the more rural schools have done down here. So I think by telling our students, which we have about 1,000 students, telling our students, we hear you, we see you, we respect you as human beings, and we're gonna fight for you, I think that's something I'm really proud of at my school. And I can honestly say, I think a lot of our students respect that, because our school has received emails from students saying, I feel safe coming to school, whereas my friends in Chicago might not, or, you know, different places.
Yeah, I think it's really definitely important to make sure people are comfortable in their learning environment and are like, you know, recognize that they're seeing themselves in the people around them. Kind of something I wanted to say, going back a little bit to what Katie said, is it matters like who you talk about, but it's also important to look at like the history that we do learn currently and re-examine it to make sure that like what we're learning is actually factual, even if it means the people who have usually been historical heroes weren't actually that.
I want to add on to what Shannon is saying about making sure that the books are factual. If we say that, you know, I think there was either something on CBS or BBC where they were looking at old American textbooks and also some textbooks that are still in circulation, saying how white slave owners had extra helping hands from their team of slaves who lived in their comfortable bunkers off, like right outside the house. And the wording was ridiculous. It was meant for elementary and middle schoolers. And so there's colorful pictures, and the slaves are happily skipping around the fields, and the words they use are just demeaning and fake and just wrong and so horrible. And there are teachers who are like, what's wrong? We've been teaching this curriculum for 10, 15 years. The books never changed this, so it must be true. So it's looking back at those books, which hopefully with what was mentioned earlier about the education and the history, making students be un-American or whatever, hopefully that doesn't encourage these books to stay in circulation.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
Okay. I just want to say quickly, going off of that, I think, let's say it was written for first graders using the very light language. I think it's important that at a young age, we do introduce kids to the idea that, yes, horrible things have happened, and we can't just brush them off as light. And I know it has to be done in very, very carefully, especially for kids at a young age. But just because they're young doesn't mean that they can't handle big ideas that have real impact on people.
Yeah, I think maybe I can definitely see why you wouldn't want to tell kids about slavery or horrible things. But the fact that they taught them that they were happy is really a problem. Like, you could just not teach them about that part of history until they're older, maybe.
Yeah, I could see that. I think part of it too is the type of stories and the messages that, and also what is celebrated in a culture too, especially with younger kids and even an entire community or city. The types of figures that are celebrated, the historical figures who are celebrated, all has an impact on the type of cultural messages that are constantly being sent and received to people. So even especially younger kids and are very impressionable with these things. So that's part of the reason why I personally think that it's been beneficial that many people have been talking about the significance of statues in the southern United States. Where people are celebrating, well, essentially when these statues were built, it was in a monument to celebrate, figures that were not really, essentially figures that were fairly bad people overall. So that also sends a message to, community as to what's praised and valued.
I think going back to like protecting children from the truth, why is like not talking about slavery or like why don't they talk about slavery and say it's a bad thing? Well, explain how bad it is instead of portraying them as happy. Well, like at the same age, like they'll show you a video of 9/11 happening. Like where is that line being drawn?
I kind of feel like it comes back down to sort of what Alex was saying, teachers being like, well, it's always been this way in the books. This is how it's been. I think it's just relying on the momentum that our culture has around protecting patriotism in maybe the traditional sense of what it was thought. So I think it's just trying to figure out how we can break that momentum down this path that is portraying things incorrectly. But I think a lot of it just has to do with tradition, unfortunately.
If I could add on to that, if you can't tell from my picture, it appears to be a German flag. I'm a German teacher, and Germans definitely have a history that we all learn about in school. Well, how do German children learn about the Holocaust or World War I or World War II or Adolf Hitler's rise to power? How old do they have to be to learn that stuff? Well, the culture around all of those hard topics is that the citizens of Germany for decades have recognized we made a mistake against all of these people. And Germany as a country realizes if we don't educate ourselves and our children, like you have to learn from the past to move forward. So in order to make it better in the future, elementary school kids, I would say probably starting in 2nd or 3rd grade, they're getting taught foreign languages at that age. They're getting taught history from all of their neighboring countries because they recognize the more knowledge you have, the less afraid you are. And from fear is what causes a lot of these disparities. So when we're looking at Southern white America, who is fighting to keep their statues up, they're afraid that they're losing power. They're afraid that their voices are going to be muted. And if we look to other models, even in South Africa with the apartheid, if we look at different government structures all around the world who have had horrific crimes against humans, like, you can learn from knowledge. I mean, hence education and school and everything.
I think going off of that really quick, you were talking about how German students learn about the other countries surrounding them. I think that's something that might be lacking a little bit in our education as well, learning about cultures and countries different than our own. I think if we start talking about different countries at a young age and how they live, different religions and everything like that, I think as adults, people will be less afraid of immigrants coming in from different countries, because I think one of the big fears of high numbers of immigrants coming in is the fear of losing what you know and the fear of losing your culture. But it won't feel so unknown if they're taught about it when they're in school, from when they're really young.
I think that's a really good idea. Also, about something that Alexandria or Alex said. I don't know which one. Sorry. So I think in Germany, isn't it illegal to like say the Nazis were good or something? Isn't that illegal? And I think
I
that's
mean, there's definitely a line that can be crossed because, I mean, people in this country could, say communism is good, and that at one time that would have gotten you arrested and, disappeared in a way. Over there in Germany, I think it's just understood that there is like a solemn understanding. Like, a German will crack the occasional Nazi joke, just as Americans do, People just do that because it's humor. But they're making fun of the sense that it's such a tragic event. Like, they don't mean it seriously. You cannot, I don't think you can get Mein Kampf anymore. You can't dress up like Hitler. You can't do certain things to pay homage to him or his beliefs.
Yeah, they can't demonstrate. Nazis can't demonstrate, right?
Yeah, well, Nazis have gone underground / to other parts of the world, hence like Brazil, Venezuela, and the US.
Yeah, and I just think that is really good that there's kind of restrictions by the government on people demonstrating these, the Nazis demonstrating, and maybe the US could learn from that.
Well, and I just want to elaborate that a lot of European countries, not to make this a German lesson, is that there's so many countries, not just in Europe, but in Asia as well, who've done really well with this coronavirus, and that ties into like all of the traumas that many countries are going through. In the US, we have, of course, systemic racial, issues going on. But the thing is we don't trust our government. As Americans, we can have our own views because freedom. Whereas other countries in Europe and Asia, they trust their government and what they're being told. And, we have to protect our rights in America because we think we need to, because our government won't do it for us.
I think part of education too is also consistency in the consistency in education, and there shouldn't be any contradictions between what you're learning at school and necessarily what's being learned like at home or maybe within your community. So I guess going back to the statues example, or even talking about something like the Nazis, that you can't be teaching one thing in school and then people in your community on the other side are like also praising something different, or trying to teach something that's opposing, what you're learning, because then it's more difficult to learn something and it causes confusion. So I think part of the educational message is that, especially when trying to overcome things like racism and social injustice, that the message and the overwhelming consensus should be correct, and also should be, positive and inclusive for everybody. So I'm not sure how that would, I don't know, don't really have much. I can't think of a specific example otherwise, but I think that would also help in terms of, I don't know, just continuing to break down any potential barriers in the future. Whether it's whether it's specific groups of people that are opposing or preventing change, or whether it's a specific school or school district or specific local government. I think trying to identify, the specific messages, maybe within a community, or specific things that prevent those barriers will always help, and trying to get to the point where it's consistent. So.
I think you definitely need to figure out how to speak best to each community or each group of kids, but you also have to be careful of, like, bottom line, they need to get the same information to them with the same perspective. So like if there's a community that is primarily white, from the same religious background, from the same, culture, it shouldn't be, the information presented to the kids shouldn't be altered in the sense that the meaning is changing, while they might not be as comfortable with a larger focus on maybe Black history, for example, that doesn't mean that it should be dialed back to make them feel more comfortable with the education. I think it's almost backwards to what you were saying, where it's like, the more, if we have a consistent education across the US in terms of how this history is presented to us, then a generation, 2 generations down the road, there's going to be a more consistent understanding of what is and is not okay, and what perspectives are right. So it's using education to try to create a perception in day-to-day life of what is okay in terms of social justice, kind of thing.
So a question that I have, just
I
to
think
kind
that's very similar to what I was getting at. So maybe you summarized it better than I did.
just to kind of play devil's advocate, Katie, I think that all of us here have a pretty similar mindset of like what we would call right, but how do we convince people who maybe disagree with that like what we're teaching is actually the right thing and not just like liberal propaganda or whatever we want to call it?
Yeah, I mean, even 30 or 40 years down the road, what we're teaching now or what we want to teach could be construed as wrong in the future. Maybe like what we're teaching isn't focused on the environment enough, or something like that. Something bigger comes along that we don't see now. I think it might be important to adjust what we're teaching to include other perspectives, and to show that it isn't just one way is right. Like, keep some of the history that we've learned. Like, don't completely get rid of everything we've ever learned, but maybe look at it and make sure that we show the different perspectives in each instance.
Yeah, I think talking about it helps reconcile differences, because everybody has their own individual story and individual experiences. And so something that could be, let's say, racist to one person may not be racist to another person of the same ethnicity. It's very dependent on scenario and personal experience. I don't know, having I guess having support and trying to overcome those obstacles when problems arise is probably the most critical factor for an individual to overcome instances of racist rhetoric or hate, or whatever it may be. So I don't know, just continue to have support around you is a big one.
I think that's a really good point. And also, other than teaching kids facts, I think education should also be teaching people how to interact with people, because like Brad was saying, every interaction is case by case basis in terms of what is and is not okay. And so I think we should teach kids how to read other people as you're talking to them, so you can get a feel of if they're comfortable with what you're saying or if they're not comfortable with what they're saying. Because I think if we can try to teach people to have more compassion for what other people are thinking, even if they don't understand where they're coming from, I think it would be a step forward in creating constructive conversations in the future.
I also think going off that, we need to be teaching kids like how to figure out what is truthful information and what is like not truthful, like what is actually propaganda, and like how to tell the difference between like fake news and real news, and like reliable information. I think that would be really, really helpful.
Yeah, see, that's always a tricky one. And the further I get out of school, it's sometimes it can be more difficult. I don't know. But yes, I agree with what you were saying there, that sorting through facts and fiction is always a skill that's in high demand. And just to be able to sort, I shouldn't say high demand, but on a personal basis, it's very important in order to find what's true. And that's where my, I don't know, just finding the data, I think, is really, and looking at the data and making sure it's, cross-referenced and fact-checked is always a skill that's, that will lead you to finding what's true. And, that's also part of science too, is that we're limited to the data that we do have. So, we might find something that's close to what's accurate, but in a month later, after doing more study or research, we can find additional information that's more accurate than what we just had. And that's kind of the human condition, I think. So.
I like how people were talking about bias and like learning about that you have bias, and like Alexander or Alex said that in the comments. And like if you learn that your perspective as an American is biased, and then just learn about like lots of different perspectives, and like hear from people from different perspectives, like that there are multiple sides to like a story, or like in the Civil War, like what both sides were doing. And then like hear from people from perspectives of like about like African Americans, like hear from African Americans about like their history and their perspectives, if they're like offended about or if there's like an injustice issue, like hear from people from their perspectives.
And to tie off of that, I have two things. One is bias awareness. I remember being in one of my university classes talking about diversity and inclusion in the classroom. And my school was in suburban Chicago, so we had a mix of people. And I remember one day we were doing a Four Corners activity, and we were talking about bias of should students who are LGBTQ be able to hold hands in a classroom. And most of us were like, yeah, sure, why not? But there were people who were from different walks of life than us from the Chicagoland area. And one of the math teachers to be, and my peer, she was like,
I feel really uncomfortable right now because I've never really even thought of that. I don't think I've ever really met a gay person. And that was a bias that she's like, wow, maybe I'm homophobic. Or we had a student actually come out to us in class saying that she was bi and she had all kinds of stuff and she was sharing her life story with us. And it was really impactful because, you know, this one teacher to be who doesn't think she ever met a person and didn't know how she would respond actually had known this fellow classmate and teacher for the 2-3 years in our program. And so that was eye-opening even just in that context. But a bias might be that I expect that I will have running water every day. Well, maybe some students don't have water. Maybe some people in America don't have water. Maybe if I say, okay, guys, we all have to look nice for class today, and looking nice for me means, you know, combed hair, makeup, button down. Well, what if there's a kid who can't afford that or has 3 t-shirts and that's what they got? So it's understanding even those simple biases, not just the big ones of racism and the other various topics, but then also, secondly, I just wanted to mention that there is this movement that is going out ever since, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and this last week or so in Kenosha. There is this movement towards, yes, we want to listen to people who are having their voices muted or, you know, discounted. But as most of us here are white, it's not our friends who are Black, brown, gay, Muslim. It's not their job to educate us. We need to educate ourselves as best we can from reliable sources, and then seek out people who are different from us. Maybe go talk to your friend and say, hey, I've been reading up on these different, you know, influential people of color, and I really wanted to pick your brain. Is this what your experience has been like? You can have so much deeper conversations by recognizing I might not know everything about the Black human, you know, story in America. Doing your own research and then showing these people who come from these backgrounds that I see you, I respect you, and I respect you so much that I researched. That's something that is definitely starting to catch wind.
I really agree with all of that, especially like acknowledging that as white people in America, it's like our responsibility to educate ourselves, and that like we shouldn't be putting the extra like labor on people of color to educate us. Like we should be taking our own time. Like that is the least we can do, in my opinion, is to like educate ourselves.
Kind of going off of that, I kind of think that like you know how Alexandra, you were talking about how like you guys were like debating whether gay people should be holding hands. I don't think that that's really the way to go about it in like a classroom setting, at least in my opinion, because you're actively debating somebody's rights in front of somebody that could possibly like be like have those issues revolve around them, or
Absolutely.
like having
Absolutely, and that was probably so shocking for not only the students who were in that community, but also, you know, people who have friends in that community. And to put a little context to this is that it was a thought experiment for us to realize, you know, these are thoughts that, you know, are in place in different parts of the country, but I completely agree with you, Kate.
I think going off of what you were saying about the one person who didn't think that they knew anyone who was in the LGBTQ community, I think that's a really good example of how maybe personal connections can be even more impactful on someone than education ever can be. And it's hard sometimes. There's so many communities that are more or less one ethnicity or race, and it's hard to find people to interact with different backgrounds. But I think when possible, it's an important for people to try to seek it out, at least enough for you to be able to understand where that group is coming from. It's hard to put yourself in someone else's shoes, but it's especially hard if you've never even had a conversation with someone.
Yeah, I also wanted to say something about how we've been talking about education a lot, and that's very important in shaping people's mindset, and that's really great. But also, I think people's social environment plays probably an even bigger role in their views. So if you were to teach them in school to accept everyone, but they're from somewhere where they're more racist, I think they're gonna be more racist. So I think culture is really hard to change, but whether it's online or just the people that they're actually like hanging out with, I think people's culture and their group that they see themselves as a part of plays probably the biggest role in what views they have. What views they have.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Shannon, because your social influences can really make or set your ideas of what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable and what is not. And while we've been talking about education, we can't have all people who are out of school go back to school to learn this. It's how do we educate, all of the people who are college aged and up, or people in the workforce, people who are retired. How do we educate those people, to fix and overcome these problems that we're having in our country right now?
I think that that is a very great spot to end on for tonight. I want to respect everybody's time too. But I think that this has been a really great discussion where we just scratched the surface of what social justice and social sustainability can look like. So I hope that you all keep thinking about, like, what does this look like in my own life? And just thank you again for joining us today. And we really appreciate you all taking time out of your week to come and chat with us. Next week, we're going to be talking about economic sustainability. So I think, Katie, there will be a new link if you're interested in joining. Correct me if I'm wrong. But hopefully we'll see you next week.
Cool. Yep, there'll be a link. If you keep checking out Facebook, there'll be something posted soon. The link has not been created yet, but it'll probably be bit.ly/sustainablediscussion4. But it's not in existence yet, so in a day or so. Otherwise, thank you, Olivia.
Thank you all.